I call this one Burn the Ships. I want to be more than a conqueror. So I want to understand what it means for us to be a conqueror. Understand what it means to be more than a conqueror, especially with all of the things that we have to deal with. So, with that being said, I'm going to start us out with Mr. Cortez. Mr. Cortez in 1519 had got him a set of ships. Cortez had recently got him a new crew. This crew was set to sail over to Veracruz, Mexico. And when they got to Veracruz, Mexico, Cortez told his men, says, we are getting ready to conquer the land. Cortez then asked his men, he were looking weary, they were scared, they were afraid. Cortez's men were even tired. Cortez says, we are going to move forward and we are going to conquer this land. The men were definitely afraid, so Cortez made a summons. He said, look, I want you to burn the ships. Because I don't want you to have a way to turn around. I don't want you to be able to go back to your old life. I don't want you to even think that there's a way that you can return. I want the ships to be burned. One of Cortez's men, legend has it, that began to say, Cortez, we cannot burn the ships because we have to be able to return. Cortez immediately, according to legend, pulled out his sword, thrust it in the man's heart, and he fell dead right there. Cortez reiterated the order, burn the ships. He didn't want anyone to be able to turn around and go back to their former life. It was conquer or die. Cortez saw it that way. Paul then writes to us, he says, hey, Paul writes to us about being a conqueror. And in order to be a conqueror, Paul understood that you've got to go forward. There's some things and obstacles in your life that you're going to have to move and press beyond. Paul's going to tell us, hey, you need to burn the ship. There's some things in our life, I would guarantee you, there's some ships we need to burn because we keep sailing back to the same old places on these ships. We keep returning to old things that we have on these ships, and we really need to burn. Because really they are destroying us and keeping us from conquering all that God has for us. Paul then goes forward in this text and he starts to write about what it means to be a conqueror. And see, what I want you to understand what it means for you to be a conqueror. And if you want to be a conqueror, I'm going to tell you one thing, you're going to have to burn some ships. You're going to have to stand like Cortez is that, hey, we're going to move forward regardless of what is happening in my life. I'm going to move forward. I'm not turning around. Say, okay, how then can we move forward into being conquerors? See, but Paul goes on in this text and he ends it in verse 37 and he tells us that Paul says we're to be more than conquerors. I was going, man, that is great news. Because to be a conqueror is one thing, but to be more than a conqueror, that's something else. Okay, well then what is that? Because I want you to be more than a conqueror. See, a conqueror goes and they conquer, yes. And they take over, yes. They destroy everything in their path, yes, because you got to move forward. That's what a conqueror does. That's what Cortez's mission was. That's what Cortez was going to do. But when you're more than a conqueror, okay, well, let's see what it is. Okay. Be more than a conqueror, I'm going to tell you one thing is that you got to understand how I've been called. You have been called. See, Paul writes in here, he says in verse 28, we're going to go back for just a moment because I want you to get the rift of verse 31. And you can't get the rift of it unless we understand a little bit backwards. In verse 28, he says, we know that God causes all things to work together for the good for those who love the Lord. And are called, he says, what? Are called according to his purpose. Paul jumps out the gate here in verse 28, and he begins to go back and he says, look, I want you to understand that God has called you. God has called you for a purpose and a reason. God has allowed you to be here for a specific reason. And Paul says the reason God has called me is because God foreknew me. He said he predestined me. He justified me. He glorified me. Paul says he did all of those things in verse 29 and 30. Paul says all of those things happened in my life, and God is working everything. God, in other words, God is the synergy that works in your life to bring everything that you're working toward out for the good and the profit of those who have been called according to the purpose of an almighty God. See, so everything that's happening in your life, when you call it good, you've got to understand that God is the one behind the scenes working it out, putting all the pieces in order that they may come to the conclusion that will be for your profit. Paul says, God has worked all of these things so that in the end, my life would be profitable for those that are around me. This is what Paul is saying. Paul says, this is how I've been called, and God foreknew me when he did this. He predestined me. He called me. He said, God then pushed me in to glorify me and justify me. He said, Paul said, God did all of those things. Now when we get to verse 31, see, here's the crux of it. Verse 31 comes with only two words. Two words, but out of it we translate all of the questions that we see in 31. But it's only two words in Greek. In Greek it said, that was God. Okay, you're still not feeling that. I don't think you're still feeling it. Because Paul was saying, what all the things that work in my life, that come together and that build on top of one another, the path that God has laid out, when it all comes out to the profit of me, understanding that God foreknew me, justified me, called me, predestined me, glorified me, and did all of those things in my life, he turns and he says in 31, he just says, all I can say is that was God. See, that's how it translates. He just translates and he said, all of those things that happened, all I can conclude is that was God. Paul is coming to the conclusion in 31 when he starts a new paragraph and said, when I look back over things, I realized that that was God. See, when I went through the storms, let me tell you when I went through the storms of life and I look back and God brings me out, then I have to conclude that was God. You see, when my life looked like it was about to derail, and then I was all of a sudden put back on the tracks, and I look at it and I've got to conclude that was God. See, when I realized that when my marriage was about to fall apart and then it got back together again, he said, see, that was God. See, when I realized all of a sudden, it looked like my bills are heavier than what I can maintain and do, and yet I'm still able to do everything, he's concluding that was God. See, when he's coming to the conclusion that when my health was failing and I was able to stand and the doctor gave me a good report that was profitable for my life, he's going, that was God. You see, Paul was saying when I had the thorn in my side and grace came upon the scene and carried me through, Paul comes to the conclusion that was God. See, so when he gets here to verse 31, he's coming to the conclusion that the mercy that has been laid upon my life is because that was God. Yeah. See, he's coming to the conclusion that the love I have in my life is because that was all God. So when he says, I'm able to forgive, Paul is coming to the conclusion that was all because of God. So when he writes in verse 31 and he gets here and writes, he says, whom then shall we say? He's going to conclude that was God. So his question is a conclusion that he writes in Greek simply to say, all of these things that have happened in my life is because I've been called by God for the very purpose of God, who has ordained my life, who's predestined me. He said, in the conclusion is, I want you to know is, that was God. So Paul is coming back and his writings are so good when he comes and he said, God has caused all of these things. See, everything that I went through to work together for the good. Because I believe, Paul is writing, I believe that nothing, see, no one, no incident, nothing can change the fact that God is working in my life. Because Paul has come to the conclusion, I'm a conqueror because I've been called. And because I've been called, I understand That is all God. See, that's his whole point when he gets to verse 31. His whole point is to tell you all of that was God. So when anything happens, Paul said that was simply God. But he goes on and he says in verse 32, he continues and he says, now I want you to understand all of this was God. But in verse 32, then he raises up and he says, he who even did not spare his own son. Now look at what Paul says. He said, that has been God who has been working in my life, and let me tell you how. See, because God has called me for the very purpose of God. And he said, God has called you as well. So he's writing to the Romans to let them know, hey, you're going to be a conqueror. And in order to understand that, you've got to know that God has called you as well. And God is going to be given generously in your life. Okay? Because Paul says God is going to give generously into the life of those who have been called. Now, how does he say? He says they're going to freely be able to give. Bring the verse on the screen. They're going to be able to freely give into the life of those who are his conquerors or ones who have been called by him. Now look at what the text says. He says, in the text, Paul says, what God has done, God has gave his only son. And because he gave that which is greater, his only son, surely, according to Paul's right, surely won't God give to those whom he have called, predestined, justified, and foreknew, and glorified those like us. Paul is saying, surely if God gave his son and turned him over to the hands of those in authority at that moment and gave him over to that authority, surely God, now listen, Paul is saying, surely God will give to those whom he has called. Paul is saying, if God did that, the greatest thing of giving his son, surely he will do the lesser thing of giving to those who are called. And Paul says, not only will he do that, he says in verse 32, keep it on the screen, he says in verse 32, he will give it freely, give us all things. Paul says, if God is working together for the good for all of us who have been called according to his purpose, he's saying that if God is giving away his son, which is the greatest thing that you could possibly do, surely he's going to take care of those who he's called. That would be you and I. And Paul then says he's going to take care of us generously. Paul says he's going to do it abundantly. Paul says he's going to give us more than you can even ask or think. Paul is telling us right here, a lot of things are going to be poured out in your life simply because he wants to do it freely to those whom he has called, because he wants everything to work together for the good, for those, for the purpose of God. Surely he can do that. I know, because listen. I knew an older gentleman named Mr. Charlie. That's what I called him. I called him Mr. Charlie. I must call him Mr. Charlie for the longest. That's the way I knew him. That was his name, Charlie. So I would just add Mr. in front of him, Mr. Charlie. Now I was a young buck, just getting into the church. Just getting into the church. Just starting to go to church. And I was sitting there with Mr. Charlie. I said, look here, Mr. Charlie, I got a problem. I was just talking. I got a problem. He asked me, he said, Tim, look, what's your problem? I said, this here, I got a wife. We're going to start right there, Mr. Charlie. See, now, y'all take that wrong. Y'all take that wrong. Don't take that wrong now. I love my wife now, but it was a problem at this time. It was a problem. So I told Mr. Charlie, I said, look here, Mr. Charlie. Here's my problem. I said, I got this wife, and she likes to spin. And she goes to the ATM. Back then, she withdrawing from the ATM. And Mr. Charlie, I'm not seeing the receipts. I said, I'm not seeing them, Mr. Charlie. And so I'm thinking, there's one thing in the account, there's another thing, Mr. Charlie. And he said, oh my gosh, I understand your problem. He said, I understand. I said, what? Okay. He said, but I'm going to give you some information that's going to solve it for you. I said, okay, I'm listening, Mr. Charlie. I'm listening. He said, what you do is, now this was his advice, what you do is, you have her to take out her piece of money that she's going to spend, and she doesn't have to go to the ATM. I was like, oh, that seemed logical. It seemed smart. He gave me that advice. And we began to do that. Hey, no more problems after that. Everything was fine, copacetic, no more issues. But what I'm saying is that if Mr. Charlie is willing to give me advice generously, and we're just guys, think about what God would do, who loves you beyond a brotherly love, who loves you unconditionally. You who have been called according to the purposes of God. You whom God who foreknows, predestined, justified. You who works for the purposes of God. Guess what? God will do a lot more than what Mr. Charlie did for me. Mr. Charlie simply gave me advice. God will give you the advice and give you the solution, and God will provide it as well. God will do a lot more for those who have been called. Now, if that's what a man would do, imagine what God would do. See, when you've been called according to the purposes of God, when you have been called for God to use in your life so that God can work within it and bring everything out for the profit of you. See, when you've been called, Paul is saying, God will pour generously, and give you everything you could possibly need to overcome every obstacle in your life. That's what Paul is trying to tell us. Paul says, if you want to be more than a conqueror, this is what had happened. God will work in your life this way, and guess what? There might be some ships. And when they float up, you're going to have to burn them. There are some things you cannot go back to. Now, I could have went back to the old way, but Mr. Charlie said, don't do it. You got to burn the ships. When you've been called, there's some ships you got to burn, and realize that God is working in your life. He says, not only that, he says, but I've been called, but he says, I have confidence. Paul says, look in verse number 33. He says, not I have confidence. He says, now who is going to bring any charge against God's elect? Because God is the one who justifies. Verse 34, he is the one who condemns. Paul then turns around and he says, look, I got confidence in God. And the reason I can have confidence in God is because Paul is writing that there are going to be people who come into your life and they're going to want to condemn you. And Paul specifically comes back and he says, who is the condemner? We all know Satan is the accuser. And listen what Satan does. Paul is writing this from the perspective that he understands that Satan is keeping a log over everything we're doing. He's sitting there typing it all up. And then when we get to court, Paul is presenting this thing as if when we stand before the court, that Satan's going to be there with his log of issues and things and say, look, let me tell you about this person here. Let me tell you the story that they have. They're not telling you everything that's going on in their life. Let me condemn them and point the finger at them and tell you why they're not so good. So you can stand in court. Paul's idea is that you would be standing in court and there would be someone right across condemning and pointing their finger at you and telling you why you can't come into the kingdom of God. He's saying right there, someone's going to be accusing you and condemning you and telling you why. He's going to remember every lie you told, every cheat you did. He's going to remember all of those things and have it logged. This laundry list of things. Paul is saying, well, who is going to be able to condemn us? Paul is saying, I'm convinced. Paul is saying, I have the very confidence that God would be right there for me when it comes time for me to stand in the courtroom. Paul is saying, when I get ready to go and tell my story before the judge, he's saying, I am convinced. I have the absolute confidence that God will be there working on my behalf. He said, I don't care who is there going to be able to condemn me. And people will definitely say why you can't do stuff. It happens all the time. They're not going to be able to have the same confidence that you have in God. And see, you can't have self-confidence. That's a big difference. Self-confidence is confidence in you. It's in confidence in your abilities and what you can do. But Paul is saying, I've got confidence in God. That's totally different. See, when you have confidence in God, it doesn't matter about my abilities. It doesn't matter what I can do. It all matters what God can do. And see, God can do a lot more than simply I can do. So I don't have confidence in any decision I'm going to make. No, I'm going to go to God and ask God, would you help me make the decision that I need to make? See, I don't have confidence in my abilities. I'm going to go to God and say, God, would you grant me the abilities to be able to do? I don't have confidence in whatever I bring to the table. I'm going to have confidence in what God allows me to bring to the table and work through me. So Paul then is saying, I can't worry about being condemned, because when I go to the courtroom, I know it's already worked out. See, so Paul has such great confidence that he's saying that when he stands before God, who's going to bring this charge against him? He said, what happens is God is the one who justifies. Look at that in verse 34. He is the one who condemned, but Christ Jesus is died. No. He says in verse 34, I like this. Because he turns and he said, the reason I have such great confidence is why? Because Christ died upon, and then he went, no. Wait a minute. He raised. Look at the verse. He says, wait a minute. Christ died? No. He said, no. But rather, what? He was raised. Paul says, my confidence is in the fact that God got up. See, the fact that, not that he simply died, but the fact that he got up. And because he got up, Paul is saying, I have great confidence in the fact that God will be right there for me when I get ready to stand in the courtroom. See, it's one thing when you're able to go in the courtroom and someone able to condemn you and put their laundry list and stand against you. Paul is saying, when I go to the courtroom, Paul is saying, yeah, I'm standing there, and guess what? Somebody's telling me what to say to the judge. He said, and then somebody is also defending me and telling me that, hey, I'm going to defend you in front of the judge. That same person that's defending me is also runs up there, and then he's the judge, and he gets ready to pronounce my sentence. And he said that same person runs over here, and he said he's the jury listening at my case. And then he said that same person runs over here, and he says, I'm going to be the one that pronounces your sentence. In other words, Paul is saying, when I go to court, hey, I got the judge, jury, and executioner all on my side. That's what Paul is saying. Paul is saying all of them are on my side. So he says, I got great confidence when I go into the courtroom. Because Christ, what? He died. No. He said he raised. And see, since he said he raised, he said that is then, and he says right then, the fact that he's raised, he says he's doing what? Sitting at the right hand of God. Doing what? Interceding on my behalf. In other words, he's whispering in his ear, saying, hey, he's with me. All right. She's with me. And because they're with me, we're going to already find them not guilty when the verdict's read. So when they stand, they're going to already be ready, not guilty. I said, man, this is God. He writes with such confidence his idea that you and I can be more than conquerors. Why? Because we've been called and we have all of this great confidence in God. Let me tell you about four girls named Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, and Carol Robinson. The name sound familiar? 1963. September 15th. They were on their way to sing Father Abraham had many sons. They were on their way to sing that song. And while they were going up the stairs of the church, guess what? The bomb went off. All four of them died. The bomb in Birmingham, Alabama. They knew who did it. Matter of fact, they found the guys. They found the guys who did it. Guys coming to court. They knew they were going to get off. How do you know you're not going to be pronounced guilty? They walk in the courtroom with great confidence, knowing that their sentence will be found not guilty. And you've been charged with a crime. You are the one who did the crime. You got the evidence that points that you are the person who did the crime. But when you walk in the courtroom, you know you're going to be found not guilty. How is that the case? The judge was on their side. The prosecuting attorney on their side. The jury on their side. The people that was their lawyers on their side. Everybody in the courtroom on their side. Wait a minute. You're on their side, but they were found. We know that they were the ones who did it. The evidence points to them. The log says you did it. We have people that will point and say, they are the ones. But yet, they walk away free. Paul says, that's the kind of confidence I have. Paul says, when I get ready to walk in, the courtroom may be filled with my enemies. It may be defendants on the other side. It may be people who have seen me commit the crimes. Paul says, but you know what? I've got the one who is going to be on my side. I've got the one who's interceding on my behalf. I've got the one who's my jury. I got the one who's my judge. I got the one who's my lawyer. And he's also the one that's going to be the prosecutor. He's everything. And because he's everything, Paul is saying, when I sashay in the courtroom, I can come with such great confidence because I know God is going to find me not guilty. Paul said that's the type of God I have. Paul is saying this is how I can be a conqueror. He says I can be a conqueror because I've been called, and he says I have this great confidence in God. And then he says, finally, he says, last thing in verse 35, he says, I'm convinced. He says, I'm convinced. He says in verse 35, he says, who then can separate me from the love of Christ? That was his question. He asked it again at the end of 38 and 39. He says, who can separate me from the love of Christ? Look at how he breaks it out in two different things. In 35 and 36, he asks, who can separate me from the love? Who can pull God's love away from me? The idea is not that you're loving on God. The idea Paul has here is that God's loving on you. God's idea here, Paul is saying, is that God is pouring out his love upon us, and you can't stop it. You can't push it away. You can't stop it from going. And Paul's talking about a love that simply overflows. Paul is talking about the love of Christ being poured onto us, and he said, I can't separate myself from the love that God is pouring upon me. He said it's impossible. It can't be done. Paul is saying God continues to pour that love on us over and over again. And Paul then says, you know what? There's some physical things that may be able to separate us from the love of God, but he says, I can't think of one. Paul says it may be the fact that I'm distressed. He says it may be persecuted, tribulation, famine, nakedness. He said there's some physical things that maybe could separate us from the love of God. But he said, I can't think of one. He said, I've been in all of these situations where I've been ripped down, naked, I've had famine. Paul says I've been in tribulation, persecution. But even with all of that, I sit there in the jail and God's love still pours. He said, even with all these physical things that are going on with my body, Paul said, God's love is still pouring. Paul said, so Paul is saying, I can't think of one thing that would stop God's love from being poured upon me. And I put barriers up, and God still shows he loves me. I said, wow, this guy can write. I said, it would remind me of when we were at dinner the other night with my son, my wife, and we had his girlfriend with us. You know what she did? I'll tell you what she did. She knocked the water over. Knocked the water over on the table. The water fell over on the table. My wife sitting beside me. We had to push back from the table. Water just pouring out all over. Comes and it starts dripping. We get the napkins. We're trying to stop it. And the water's still just pouring all over the place. Paul is saying that's how God's love is. He said you might try to stop it, but it's just like an overflow of water. It can't be stopped. That's Paul's point. He said you can try to stop it, but it's going to continue to pour. It can't be stopped. So he's saying it's impossible no matter what barriers that are placed up. He said, I can't think of one that would stop the overflow of the love of God. And then he does it in 38, 39, he does it then from a spiritual perspective. He turns and he says, I can't think of anything that would stop the love of God from overflowing in our life. And he said, matter of fact, I'm thinking of principalities, heights or depths. He said, I'm thinking of all kinds of things in the spiritual realm, and they can't even stop the love of God. Angels and principles, he said, they can't even stop the love of God that he has for who? Verse 28, those who have been called according to the purposes of God. Paul says, this is how I know I can be a conqueror, because I've been called according to the purpose of God, and everything that is happening in my life is working out for the profit of me, because I've been called. And he says, when I stand before anybody who's condemning me, I have the great confidence. So he goes, therefore, I'm convinced that nothing can separate me from God's love who continues to pour it out upon me, whether it's things that are in the physical or things in the spiritual. Paul says it doesn't matter, because I am one of God's children. But then in verse 37, he does a catch. He says in verse 37, he says, even though I'm being 36, being turned over and being persecuted on a regular basis as a sheep being led to slaughter and being killed for being my belief in God, he says in verse 37, but in all of these things, all of what things, Paul? The fact that I can't be separated from God's love in the physical or the spiritual. Paul says, but in all of these things, he says, I am more than an overwhelmingly conqueror. He says, what I am is this, through him who loved us. Paul says in verse 37, in the end, this is where I stand, is that I am even more than a conqueror. Why? Because in verse 28, I was called for the very purpose of God. That when God begins to work all things out for my profit, he says, so that, why is he working these things out? So that you would come and turn and share that gospel of others. See, when you're more than a conqueror, it's more than simply defeating the enemy. It's also converting the enemy. See, when you're more than the conqueror, you go past all of those things that hurts and damages in your life. You go more than simply defeating, you begin to convert. See, more than a conqueror is going past all of the things and obstacles. Yes, you pushed through them. You defeated them. You defeated them in the spiritual and you defeated them in the physical. But Paul says, hey, we need to go beyond that. And he says, you've been called for a reason. Not to just sit on the gift that God has given. Paul says it's beyond that. So he says, yeah, I'm more than a conqueror. Yeah, he wants us to be more than a conqueror. More than simply defeat them, but convert them. Because you have this gospel message that shall be given to others. And when you do, he said, that's when you move beyond simply conqueror to an overwhelmingly conqueror. More than a conqueror.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the sermon and encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, you will receive even more encouraging words from Pastor Tim. Remember, in addition to the videos, with a simple registration, you can receive the Life Notes. Pastor's outline and scripture references for his sermons will come directly to your inbox each week. Thank you again for watching. You are always invited to attend our morning worship services every Sunday morning starting at 10 a.m. Bible studies are Wednesday evenings starting at 6:30. You've been listening to Pastor Timothy Jones of Rockbridge Church, Allen, Texas, where we follow the Go MC mission: God, others, ministry, and community.